So before I start, I would like to pay respect to all the Indigenous people and local communities across the globe who work hard to maintain the flow of ecosystem services that we all enjoy. And I'll describe those ecosystem services that we are enjoying in terms of, having good air to breathe, water to drink, and a good environment to live in. So very grateful for those people who work hard. And I work on Larakia lands in the Northern Territory most of the time, but also travel to other lands as well. So I acknowledge the TOs of those lands who've been working hard to maintain the flow of those ecosystem services for all of us, not just for themselves. So before I start, I would like to give you a little bit of background where I come from and the talk that we will be probably, I think I would like to make it more like a knowledge sharing kind of platform. So feel free to ask me questions in between. Because we don't have many people around. So I think we can have a good conversation within this small group. We've got about 10, 11 people. So I think I would appreciate if you feel like interrupting me somewhere, please do so. So I come from ecological economics kind of background. I moved into this field. I'm an ecologist by training, but moved into ecological economics about 25 years back during my master's, and into Indigenous research about 15 years back, where when I was doing my postdoc at James Cook University. So I started actually looking at how ecosystem services from rainforests in the wet tropics play a role towards the well-being of Aboriginal people there. And that study became part of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was the United Nations initiative back in 2003, started in 2000 and went up to 2005. And that kind of led me in this field of understanding the intangible values of forest ecosystems or natural resource management towards Indigenous well-being. So my main interests are in ecosystem services. Those who don't know what ecosystem services are, so ecosystem services are the benefits, which includes goods and services that we get from natural systems, or in some ways people say it's nature's contributions to human well-being. So that includes like air, good air to breathe in, water, aesthetic services, recreational services, any spiritual services, a number of those cultural services, provisioning services. Our food mainly comes from nature in one way or the other. Most of the things that we think of, yes, technology is playing a big role, but if you try to pin down, where those things come from, the origin is nature's resources. So my interest is in understanding ecosystem services values, assessing those values, both monetary and non-monetary. Particularly, I'm interested in non-monetary assessments and incorporating Indigenous perspectives into this kind of that thinking about. I put this thing down so I can read. So incorporating Indigenous perspectives in understanding those values. So we know what those values are, not just applying these standard economic frameworks. And then where recently I've been focusing on is developing ecosystem services-based economies for remote Indigenous communities across Northern Australia. So this particular talk is focused on just one little strand of that research, which is about how we got to this journey of developing ecosystem services economies. As I'll talk about that, Indigenous land use and fire management is a big thing across Northern Australia. So in this talk, we will kind of go through that, and then we'll come to this sharing the knowledge about carbon economy, which is operational in Northern Australia, and then how it's leading to future ecosystem services kind of opportunities, which are much more broader than just the carbon abatement, which is happening, greenhouse gas emissions abatement, which is currently happening across the north. So just a bit of context about Northern Australia. When we talk about Northern Australia, So we are mostly talking about, somewhere around after Carnarvon in the Kimberleys and up to Rockhampton in Queensland, all that, and it includes all of the NT. So it's a huge land mass, which is about, I think, nearly 2.7 million square kilometers. And when you look at this land mass, there is a lot of Indigenous interest in land rights. So about 80% of that total land mass is in one form or the other under Indigenous land rights. So that's a quite kind of significant interest in land across Northern Australia among the Indigenous people. And most importantly, there are more than about 200 communities who are dispersed across this landscape. So this is just counting for the major communities. And one important thing that I would like to highlight about these people living in these communities is most of them are permanent. When you talk about many other people who live across Northern Australia, altogether about 1.3 million people, but most of them are there temporarily. So for a few years you spend there, and if you like it, you may live there, but most of the time people travel to other places for their job and other things. But Indigenous peoples are the ones who are living there permanently. So the economies, the systems that we want to develop should be more suitable for those people who are living embedded within that landscape. And they have got imbued relationships for the landscape all across the north, as we all know. And these things need to be embedded in developing any kind of economies that we are thinking ahead while we are thinking about developing Northern Australia. I'll come to that in a minute. So this developing the North agenda been pushed by the Australian government since 2015, when it came into practice, where government actually allocated a lot of funds, significant funds, especially in infrastructure, establishing a CRC, developing for Northern Australia, water resource assessments for agriculture development that's been conducted by CSIRO. So there have been a lot of that investment, but a significant proportion of that investment has been on developing infrastructure, mining, and agriculture, where Indigenous people have got little interest. So to me, if we really want to develop the North, when we know the people who are living permanently within that landscape are the Indigenous people, we should be thinking about developing economies. One of the example about how developing the North agenda is suiting or not suiting Indigenous people, there is a lot more focus now than what it was a few years back. So now we got an Indigenous reference group established within CRC Northern Australia, but this CRC is now having only 3-4 years. But back when CRC started, so we proposed this ecosystem services proposal, and they were not open at that time to any of these, kind of economies that's not currently existing in the market. So how can we develop something new that could suit Indigenous peoples? So there has been, I must acknowledge, some investment in Indigenous Ranges program, and also some in initiating or kind of having agricultural initiatives in some of the remote communities. So when we look at the land use, most of the land, about 80% in Northern Australia, is under pastoral beef production. So all those green areas are where it's mostly conservation in one way or the other, IPAs or protected areas, national parks. But all that red area, that's pastoral land use for beef production. And as we all know, that pastoral beef production is highly political, and there is a lot more, support for this kind of land use. But when we compare it, who is there across the North and the people embedded within the landscape, they're well distributed all across the landscape, are the Indigenous people. So Indigenous peoples are probably least involved in pastoral land use. So there are very few enterprises that we can say, especially successful enterprises from Indigenous side, operating all across Northern Australia. So with that kind of background, I just wanted to provide you a bit of understanding where the Northern context comes from and how this pastoral production for beef is a kind of a dominant land use and still being supported under developing the North agenda to a large extent. And to kind of promote our or provide a kind of a logical explanation for developing ecosystem services economies. So we conducted this ecological economic assessment of pastoral estate across the North. And the idea was that doing this exercise could help us build the case for ecosystem services economies that could actually suit Indigenous peoples. So we conducted a detailed 10-12 year using 10 or 12, I think 12 years database from EAIBT of pastoral land use all across Northern Australia. Most of our area was focused on from like Broome to Townsville, which we call Savannah country. So all this green area is Savannah country, but this line here is where we got operational carbon economy, and that was our focus area for our study. So the reason, as I said, there is a lot of common support and there is a lot of lobbying to support the pastoral industry in the North, but the sustainability of those pastoral industries, pastoral enterprises has got a big question mark. So that's where we started building the case. So when you look at the pasture capability all across Northern Australia, so all these green areas are where we got high pasture capability. All the orange areas are where we got moderate kind of pasture capability across the landscape, and very low, most of the landscape, which is about 60%. So with that kind of pastures that's available in the North, the carrying capacity is much less than compared to the pasture systems down south. So most of these light yellow kind of areas, they can only have up to 5 head of cattle per square kilometer, compared to like these green, the Carpentaria Gulf and a bit of this Ode and Kununurra area, and few spots here in the Kimberley, that can have about 10-15 head of cattle per square kilometer. So largely, this area is having a very low carrying capacity. So when we look at the financial returns from all across the North, all these areas which are, except for the Kimberley and for the Barkly region, most of these areas, Cape York, Top End, Northern Australia, Alice Springs area, and rest of here, Queensland, the returns are very less. So an average size pastoral enterprise will only generate about $27,000 per property per year. This is just an average. And most of the businesses in this part of the world, about 70% are average pastoral businesses, and 30% what we call are the top performing pastoral businesses. The top performers are the ones that are generating benefits, but that 70%, the majority of them, which we call the typical pastoral businesses, are not actually generating any main income. So this is just their earnings before tax, before interest. So when we take interest out, which we call earnings after interest, but before tax, so then most of them are running into losses. So as you can see in the top end, huge loss, and same in the Cape York area. except for the Barkley and the Kimberley. And if we take text out, then these returns will go further. So the question is, and if we take another account of environmental losses that's been caused by the pastoral business all across Northern Australia, there is a huge literature on land degradation, greenhouse gas emissions from cattle, soil erosion, gully erosion, and pollution of water resources all across Northern Australia. So we just included two kind of costs. One was land degradation, another greenhouse gas emissions from cattle, and then all the pastoral enterprises across Northern Australia are running into losses. And our argument to include those environmental costs are that at the end, public is going to pay for those costs to fix those land degradation and greenhouse gas emissions. And in a way, we are paying for those greenhouse gas emissions through other initiatives like this emissions reduction fund. So there is a public money, that public liability that's been created by running those businesses. So it's not just us saying this, that the pastoral sector is doing poorly all across Northern Australia. It's also been said by the financial experts in the pastoral sector. So this report, the Australian Beef Report, even if you see the recent one, it's every second, third year, it's been released by these experts to provide an overall financial picture. And even the recent one, 2022, is saying the same thing, that the financial performance of the beef industry, especially in the Northern Australia, is poor, and it's very alarming. And they say Northern Australia is overgrazed, and there is evidence that environmental capital is being used up. And it still says the same if you see the recent report. And this is one of those landmark reports that MLA and other bodies highly rely upon. So one of the things that these experts say, they focus a lot more being from financial background. They advocate a lot more about financial management. But when we look at the carrying capacity of these lands all across the north and the number of cattle that the graziers are having on their properties, it's just not environmentally sustainable. But the good thing is, in the recent report, they're recognizing more about this intertwine between environmental sustainability and beef production. So there is a lot more understanding now, and now that if we are focusing on environmental sustainability, we can also enhance beef production and hence our financial gains. And I think the second thing to add to this one is that MLA has also has a mandate that by 2030, we want to be net zero in pastoral sector. So there is a bit of that stimulus for many pastoral businesses to actually start thinking about environmental sustainability. But I do want to acknowledge that there are benefits of running a successful, sustainable pastoral enterprise in well-managed situations, because it helps to manage weeds, feral animals, and fire. And so there should be some stewardship arrangements for those businesses. So that, with that kind of backdrop information, I think that what it suggests us that there is a clear need for diversification of Northern Australia, and if we want to develop it sustainably. So that means that we need to look for opportunities which are sustainable and which are suitable for the Indigenous peoples and other land users who live all across Northern Australia. So one of the key things in Northern Australia is fire. You have heard about fire in southern part of Australia, but North experiences it almost every year. So all those purple dots, that's where we got fire almost every year in late dry season. So most of the fires occur from like September, October onwards until the rainy season comes. So about December. And those fires are very severe, they are hot, they can spread thousands of kilometers. So you can see the patches, they're huge burning areas. And the yellow patches are the ones, red and yellow, where you see that the fire occurs almost every second year or so. So the fire frequency in the north, it's part of the landscape, it's quite high. But it also offers an opportunity for the land managers in the north. Having that high fire frequency and wildfires all across the north has led the Australian government to think about the greenhouse gas emissions that occur from these wildfires once we signed the Kyoto Protocol in 2008. So with ratification of Kyoto Protocol, the Australian government has started thinking about the greenhouse gas emissions from wildfires, just wildfires across northern Australia, just from savannas, and they contribute about 3 to 4% of our inventory. So to abate these greenhouse gas emissions, that's where this Indigenous fire management got more recognition. So Indigenous peoples all across northern Australia who have got knowledge and access to their land, they practice this prescribed fire burning, where they put these small mosaic kind of burns early in the dry season, which starts just after rain, March, April, until about July. So June, July, they want to finish it by July. So just because of the government regulations which are in place for carbon projects. So, but most of the burning happens early in the dry season to maintain the landscape and create that mosaic, having fire breaks all across the landscape, and to revive bush food and the other cultural places. There is some burning that happens late in the dry season, but most of the burning that happens early in the dry season, it helps to mitigate those late dry season fires, which create a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So with recognition of this prescribed burning early in the dry season, under the Carbon Farming Act, which came in 2011, so we have this savanna burning methodology that got recognized. And under the savanna burning methodology, so the land managers, which can be Indigenous and non-Indigenous, they can register their land parcels under that carbon project to abate greenhouse gas emissions. So under this savanna burning methodology, at this stage, it's targeted to the abatement of greenhouse gas emissions, not the sequestration, but there is a methodology in place that we are hoping this year or the next year will get into the regulation for implementation. So that savanna burning methodology is, initially it was limited up to more than 100 mil rainfall isohydrate, which is this upper green line. I hope people online can see that. But later on, with the success of these projects, this has been extended to the 600 mil rainfall isohydrate, which is the lower green line, just going below Broome and a little bit around Townsville. So it excludes the wet tropics area. So there are lots of carbon projects that's now been registered, and it's had generated huge carbon economy, which is worth about $40 million. So if we look at the land that's kind of being managed by the land managers for fire, it's about 389,000 square kilometers, and there are about 80 projects, and most of these projects are on Indigenous lands, about 56% of them. So it's only recently in the last 3 years that there are more projects on pastoral properties. Initially, this figure used to be very high for Indigenous lands. So with these carbon projects, we could abate about 7 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And most of this is happening on Indigenous lands. About 5 million tons of those greenhouse gas emissions abatement is happening just on Indigenous lands. So it's a huge part of the economy. So the carbon price has gone up. It's the whole savanna burning methodology, as with other carbon farming projects, it's been regulated by Emissions Reduction Fund. And there was initial a $2 billion investment, and then that was extended into a climate solutions fund with, I think, 2.5 billion more. So it's helping a lot of stakeholders all across Northern Australia to manage wildfires and to earn some carbon credits. And then there is also an opportunity for many of those land managers to sell those carbon credits outside the Australian government ERF system. So, for example, Arnhem Land Mob here, they sell some of their carbon credits to the Australian government, but the other carbon credits to the outside companies, Shell, Qantas, and others. So this area, that's just itself, that Arnhem Land is huge. It's about 80,000 square kilometers that's been managed by different Indigenous clans under Alpha, which is the Arnhem Land Management Corporation. So with this carbon economy that has been established since that started in about 2012, and now for the last 10 years, we have seen the success of this carbon economy, and we have seen how many social and cultural benefits it delivers to people. So we are now kind of advancing it to carbon sequestration, but also to include the social and cultural benefits and many ecosystem services that fire management generates across the landscape. So that means biodiversity, water, land management, etc. So then the other option for us is to actually expand this carbon economy beyond that 600 mil rainfall ISO height, because at this stage, this is the whole area where we got eligible projects, eligible vegetation types where carbon projects could be operationalized. But when we look at this kind of map where you see all these dark green areas, these are areas of high conservation significance, very high biodiversity values in these areas, and they comprise about 50–60% of the total landscape, if you look at the dark ones and the light green ones. So to preserve this kind of landscape, it requires a lot more efforts than just the abatement of greenhouse gas emissions. And secondly, there are people who are managing their landscapes quite nicely below that 600 mil rainfall ISO height, and they are delivering many other ecosystem services, not just the abatement of greenhouse gas emissions. So where fire occurs less frequent, but the landscape still needs to be managed. And so we've been arguing that if we really want to sustainably develop Northern Australia, we should be advancing those ecosystem services economies. And in that response, we had our submissions to the Senate Select Inquiry into the effectiveness of Australian government's Northern Australia agenda, where we propose these economies, and I hope that's been considered in some of these government initiatives, and there is a bit more openness now for these ecosystem services economies, because in Queensland, they set up a land restoration fund, which has been funding some of the what they call core benefits, and I prefer to call them ecosystem services, because they're all equal. Co-benefits gives a bit of notion that they're like, the side benefits of having one big benefit, but they're all equal, and they're all vital for people living on land and living off land. So just a quick overview why we want to extend this to ecosystem services kind of economies, because ecosystem services are the huge benefits that people are getting on-site and off-site. So in this kind of study, we looked at what are those benefits and what's the value of those benefits. that's been delivered from fire management projects all across Northern Australia. So we looked at all the projects and we looked at all the area. So we looked at the value that flows in the market, and we looked at the well-being benefits and what are the broader ecosystem services. So just an overview that if we look at the total value that flows in the market from greenhouse gas emissions is about 9 million US dollars. And if we look at the well-being benefits, they're huge. They're about 200 million per year for the Indigenous peoples living across Northern Australia. And because these benefits they apply to both on-site and off-site people, and they also help to build capacity of local Indigenous communities. So advancing these economies, we also have developed an economic rationale that it helps the government to save their expenditure on welfare, and instead those cost savings could be invested in enhancing people's capabilities. However, we do have some challenges while proposing this. Indigenous land rights, particularly non-exclusive native title rights, is a big issue. Still, we don't have, Indigenous peoples don't have economic rights to these lands. They can have a say, but they can't do much about their economic rights. So it's still a challenge. There are lack of ecosystem service market frameworks that fit Indigenous context. And within the markets that's operating in this space, especially carbon markets, there is a lack of transparency and the procedural mechanisms that deliver benefits to those people. So we need a lot of work to be done in this space. Another big lacking in Northern Australia is the local governance. So a lot of communities don't have their strong governance systems. They've been eroded due to colonization over the years. So that actually then affects the distribution of resources and funds. There is also a lack of institutional support, as the governments are still kind of getting up to speed with these new initiatives that's happening globally. There is a lot more push now from the UN under IPBES and other IPCC to look at nature-based solutions. And I think we need to kind of work hard to start having a strong support and mechanism and willingness among the states and territory governments to actually capture these initiatives. They're becoming very popular. So ecosystem services globally are worth about $42 billion a year. And we can easily, for the North, we can easily tap into those markets. So there is overall a lack of awareness about ES opportunities, and among the land managers, they need to be properly informed that what these opportunities are, what it involves, and it's happening with the carbon projects as well. So as a result, sometimes because of the failure, some carbon projects get revoked. So if they're pre-informed properly, and if they have consented, we can get much better outcomes. So huge challenges, but I tried to just summarize in just one slide. And we have summarized most of this work in this book, Sustainable Land Sector Development in Northern Australia, that's been published by the CRC Press. So where we are heading to is that from that current situation where we got lots of wildfires happening across the landscape, we want to build resilient savanna landscapes and communities and developing payments for ecosystem services for people to manage those landscapes that can enhance people's well-being. And at the end, we can have enhanced natural, cultural, social, and built capitals that can lead to sustainable development of Northern Australia at the end. There are some other economies that we've been working on, which especially building resilience of Indigenous communities to natural disasters. So wildfire is one. There are cyclones, there are floods, you name it, things happen there almost every year, every second year. So emergency management sector is another one where we are planning to have some mechanisms with the emergency management departments in each state and territory all across the North, so that people can have their say in those emergency management protocols and the mechanisms, how they control when there are floods and cyclones or wildfires happening in the community, how they manage it, and people can have a bit of say and to develop that fee for service kind of arrangements, and ultimately to build these resilient communities all across the North. So this work was mostly under that Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC program, which is now an Australian Natural Hazard Center. So Sonia is showing me that I should be finishing, and I think I'm on time. Any questions, please? Thank you so much for listening.